In the story this morning, the man who is blind, Bartimaeus, runs up to Jesus, and Jesus asks, "What do you want?" Last week, Pastor Anita reminded us to pay attention to the questions. James and John come to Jesus with a request, and Jesus says, "What do you want?" In other words, think about what it is you're asking. This week, a man who's blind comes to Jesus, and Jesus again says, "What do you want?" Now, come on, Jesus, really? He's blind. Of course, Bartimaeus wants to see. But Jesus asks anyway, "What do you want?" Perhaps Jesus doesn't want to presume. Perhaps he's asking Bartimaeus to be clear about what it is he really wants, because sometimes the things other people want for us are not the things we want for ourselves, right? Or maybe we get the things we thought we wanted, only to discover that they aren't really the things we wanted after all. Maybe Jesus asked Bartimaeus what he wants because he knows that once you see, there are things you cannot unsee. Now, in the 9 years that I have been here, it will be 10 years in February. Can you believe it? In the 9 years I have been here, this is the 4th time I've had to talk about this story. And every time, you'd think there'd be some new material, right? And every time that Jesus asks the question, and every time we sing beautifully, "Open my eyes that I might see," I hear the words of Carol Etzler, the feminist theologian and writer in the 1970s, who wrote, "Sometimes I wish my eyes hadn't been opened. Just for an hour, how sweet it would be not to be struggling, not to be striving, to just sleep securely in our slavery." Maybe Jesus wanted Bartimaeus to be sure that he wanted this gift of sight. Because once you see, there are things you cannot unsee. Are there things that you can't unsee? I wish I could unsee Lady Gaga. Wearing that, not her, she's great, but I wish I could unsee Lady Gaga wearing that dress made of meat. Really? Have you seen it? God help us. I wish I could unsee that demon possession scene in The Exorcist. Oh. I wish I could unsee those ASPCA ads. You know, the ones I'm talking about. Animals who have been abused and neglected. Oh, I wish I didn't see that. I wish I could unsee the image of that naked little girl. You remember? Running from the bombing in Vietnam. That's all the way back to 1972. And I can still see it. And oh my. I wish I could unsee that fence outside of Laramie, Wyoming, where Matthew Shepard was strung up, unconscious, left alone in the dark to die. You probably saw this week that his remains have been laid to rest in the National Cathedral in Washington. He's there, I understand, because the family was afraid that burying him anywhere else would mean that his grave would be vulnerable to ongoing desecration. Really? Bartimaeus, are you sure you want to see? Because once you see, there are things you can't unsee. I want to see, Bartimaeus says. And what has always intrigued me about this story is the irony that he wants to see, and the last thing the people in that crowd want is for Bartimaeus to be seen. Did you notice that? He yells, and the people tell him to shut up. He keeps yelling, and he yells louder and louder until Jesus finally calls for him. And then the story says, Bartimaeus, throwing off his cloak, jumped up and went to Jesus. See, if he hadn't already made a spectacle of himself, running half naked through the crowd must have been a shock. I can imagine the people in that crowd saying, boy, I didn't need to see that. I can't unsee that. And that's the point. By refusing to be invisible, to no longer be unseen, Bartimaeus not only received the gift of sight, but so did all the people who saw him. What they saw could not be unseen. Back in 2009, when I talked about this story, someone left me a poem that ends, "Those who step out into the light, who say, 'This is me, warts and all, and these people are my family, and they're your family too,' they have the gift of sight. Open your eyes and see. Open your heart, your tender heart. Love what you see, the person inside, warts and all. Give yourself over to your heart of hearts. Take notice, take heart. See what you don't want to see." To this day, I don't know who left me that poem. Maybe it was a gift from Bartimaeus himself. Sometimes it's the very things you can't unsee that can change your life. See, I've been hearing about the attempts of this government to use gender definitions as a way to try to erase the existence of transgender people. I realize that I can't hear that news and unsee the faces of my transgender friends. The government might want to make them invisible, but I cannot unsee the faces of Randy and Allison and Marcia and Kimmy and Katie Lynn. Sometimes what you cannot unsee can change your life. Rebecca Ann Parker writes about the trials of those who worked in the death camps of Nazi Europe, and she observes that it was as if these human beings had lost the ability to connect their actions to consequences. To think, she says, is to be able to see the relationships among things, the relationships of cause and effect between human beings and one another, between human beings and the earth. The prophet is one who thinks and therefore sees clearly the relationships among things. See, it's not just the disturbing things, the mind-searing images that we don't want to see that can change our lives. It's the connections and the relationships we cannot unsee that change our lives. Now, in advance of the Stewardship series, I've been reading Diana Butler Bass's book on gratitude. Stewardship Commission I'm studying for our time together. As I was reading along, I came across these words that brought me up short. If we focus, she says, we can see gratitude more clearly, how it guides us to a way of healing and compassion. With this new vision, we begin to see how it shapes our lives. Once we see, we cannot unsee. That is, by seeing the relationship of things, seeing the connection between all things, seeing that all of life is a gift, we cannot unsee what is at stake about how we live our lives. We cannot unsee that starry night sky that makes us feel like a tiny piece of that whole grand, huge universe. We cannot unsee that smile that saved the day. We cannot unsee those images of courage and service and hope. Kenneth Roth says that one of the great privileges of working at Human Rights Watch is seeing what a small group of people, combining their voices, talents, and financial generosity, can do to address even seemingly intractable problems. There is a lot we cannot unsee that has the power to change the world. In the grateful book, Diana Butler Bass tells the story of her grandmother, who left school early to help feed her family during the Depression. She got pregnant as an unwed teenager and struggled with a son who was both mentally ill and a criminal sexual predator. She was tough, and she worked hard. When she was a girl, she had dreams of becoming a teacher, but she was poor, and her local public school only ran through the 8th grade. In exchange for education, some Catholic sisters asked her to scrub the floors at the local convent they ran with a high school. She took up the offer. It was a quid pro quo arrangement. They would teach her, and in payment, she would clean for them. But when she wound up pregnant, what do you think happened? The sisters sent her packing. She never became a teacher, and she never trusted promises like that again. One of the ways we talk about gratitude, Bass says, is this quid pro quo. I do something for you, and in gratitude, you do something for me. Gratitude is not about gifts. It's about obligation, about what we owe someone who's done something for us. Bass's grandmother went on to have a successful life, but she became fiercely independent. She loved Christmas, the giving of gifts part of it, not the getting of them. She would always say, "Don't give me anything, I don't want anything." These are the words of a scrappy working class fighter, a woman who had known poverty and charity, and she never wanted to be indebted to anyone again. But when she neared 60, she developed heart problems, stopped working, and found herself dependent on my mother. This did not suit her, and things got very hard. She started reading the Bible, began talking about Jesus, and joined a small Baptist church with a quirky and kind preacher. When I get my tombstone, would somebody remember he was a Baptist minister who was quirky and kind? That'll do just fine for me. Preacher who believed in the power of salvation. And it made a difference. It changed her. She lived a few more years, not easy ones. In the long process of dying, she had realized that life was a gift and that even her hard-won victories came in part through the love and goodness of others. She had a great capacity to laugh, to see deeply, and to embrace the poor, strangers, the little guy, the outcast. The tiny Baptist church reminded her of God's love and the gifts that surrounded her. And there she learned a deep spiritual truth. None of us is truly independent. We need each other, the earth, and God. And the thread of that interdependence is grace. I love this. Grace is seeing our lives as this relationship that says, these people are my family, and they're your family too. Grace is stepping out into the light and saying, this is me, warts and all, kind and quirky. Grace is what helps us to see what we may not want to see, what we may be afraid to see, that none of us are independent of each other. All of life is a gift. Bass says that on occasion, I would go to church with my grandmother. She really loved the hymns, especially Amazing Grace, a hymn she had never sung until she joined that little church. And I have to wonder what old John Newton would have thought of that. I can imagine that his life as a slave trader meant that there were horrible things he could not unsee. Living human beings thrown overboard to lighten the load. The cruelty of just keeping people in line. The smell of untreated sickness and the sounds of agony. There were things, I'm sure, that old John Newton could not unsee. But in the end, what saved him was the willingness to see the wretchedness of his own life and the truth that we are all connected in that great thread of interdependence that is called amazing grace. I once was lost, but now am found, he writes. Was blind, but now I see. Bartimaeus, are you sure you want to see? Because once you see, there are things you cannot unsee. Yes, he says, I want to see. Open your eyes and see. Open your heart, your tender heart. Love what you see, the person inside, warts and all. Give yourself over to your heart of hearts. Take notice. Take heart. See what you don't want to see. Maybe you'll see more in the person in front of you and in your own spirit than you dreamed or dared to dream was possible. Pay attention to all you can't unsee. And today, if you hear God's voice, the sound of that amazing grace, take heart. Do not harden your hearts and see more than you dared to dream was possible.